Welcome to the latest program in a new series from FedGov Today, Zero Trust in Depth. I'm the host of FedGov Today, Francis Rose. This May will mark the third anniversary of the White House executive order on cybersecurity that calls for agencies to implement zero trust security models. January was the two-year anniversary of the publication of the federal government's zero trust strategy. On this program, you'll go in depth with movers from government and industry that are leading the zero trust journey. Leaders from the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the Department of Defense, the Department of Labor, GDIT, and Fortinet Federal are here to discuss what they're doing with zero trust now, what it means, and what's ahead for zero trust and for government-industry collaboration. We begin with Sean Connolly, Senior Cybersecurity Architect and TIC Program Manager at CISA, and Don Yeske, Director of the National Security Cyber Division at DHS. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. It's great to see both of you. Don, I'll start with you. Where would you say DHS is right now on its zero trust journey?
To be fair, there's a lot to DHS. So there are 23 different offices, agencies, organizations inside DHS. They are in different places, and there's a lot of diversity there. If I had to sum it up with an analogy, here's the analogy I would use, and it's borrowed from CISA, from the version 2.0 of the Zero Trust Maturity Model, has this great picture at the beginning describing zero trust maturity as climbing like Mount Everest, right? You're climbing a large mountain. And I looked this up. The base camp where you stop when you're going to go climb to the summit of Mount Everest is at 18,000 feet. It's at 18,000 feet. For reference, if you're in a plane and the plane loses cabin pressure, the pilot will very quickly descend below 10,000 feet. And the reason for that is because people lose consciousness above that level. So if you're on this climb, right, you've spent years equipping yourself and training yourself and getting ready to go to the summit of Mount Everest. And the longest part of that journey is getting to and staying at that base camp at 18,000 feet, where athletes learn to be athletes again in an environment that's hostile to human life. That's kind of where we are. We've done a lot of work. We should take stock of that. We should be proud of that. We've improved, what we do with identity. We've taken control of our devices, right? We've started to segment our networks. There are a lot of things that we've done that we should be very, very proud of, that we were told to do in M2209, right? And we report on that. I would say, though, with everything that we've done, we've really only set the stage for the hardest part of the climb. So when I look at my counterparts across the federal government, when I talk to industry about this, we're all kind of at the same point. We're just reaching that high altitude base camp. Maybe some folks have started to move out from there, or we're lingering there, and we're trying to figure out what to do next.
We'll talk more over the course of the conversation about how you're going to move the lingerers and measure the movers, and I appreciate you being here. Sean, it's great to see you. Don teed us up really well for version 2 of the Zero Trust Maturity Model. What's in there, and what do you want agencies to use it for as they're going through what Don talked about doing at DHS?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. We released version 2 in April of last year. That reflects, in the summer of 2022, led through the White House Office of Management and Budget, Claire Monterona's federal CIO shop, and the federal CISO shop under Krista Russia, his team, ourselves from CISA, GSA, some other zero trust SMEs from around the government. We met with each of those agencies in the summer of 2022, reviewing those architectural plans that you mentioned in your intro. From all those discussions with the very large agencies and a number of discussions with all the small agencies, that all fed into what we transitioned from version 1 of the maturity model into version 2. And there's a couple big differences. First one is kind of going where Don was talking about. The original model just had traditional, advanced, and optimal, 3 stages to assess where you are. We realized, talking to all the agencies, then also with a number of organizations just in general, the greater IT community, that the biggest transitions from that traditional to the next step. And so we introduced the initial stage just to show, kind of where Don was talking about, how organizations are beginning to move out in the pillar and different stages, where they are. Like, that was the biggest question. When do we know we started that zero trust journey? That's what we laid down for the initial stage. So that was part of the new differences. And then we also, working with agencies, we kind of realized there's some technologies that could be better adapted to represent what's in zero trust strategy, the OMB memo, or some efforts also toward the automation front or the governance front. So all those things fed into what was the difference between version 1 and version 2 and where agencies are today, I think.
You said the biggest question was, when do we know we've started? What are the other big questions that you've gotten, especially since version 2 came out, in anticipation? I imagine there'll be a version 3 at some point.
Yeah, so that's funny. Don was talking about the mountain. I think the secret with going up that mountain, if you get to the top of the mountain, you're going to find some mountain range. At some point, we're going to move the goalpost. There's going to be another mountain behind it. Technology is always changing. The adversary is always adapting what they have to do. So we can't be static in the model. So that was part of it, was what's next? How do we adapt or just programmatically and organizationally respond to how zero trust is being adopted across the federal government itself? One thing that's interesting about the maturity model, it talks a lot about tech. But the biggest part of zero trust is the people, the process, the organization part of it. That is adamantly out of the maturity model. But that's, I think, where we have a lot of the better discussions. I think we're trying to figure out how to represent how the zero trust philosophy or discipline is incorporated into the agency's mission, into the business organization itself. So that may be some areas where we look at going forward, of how to represent those in the next version of maturity model. But to be honest, we're not looking at releasing a maturity model for a few years. We want there to be some time. It's not, some documents you want to come out at a faster pace, but the maturity model, I think, just every 4 or 5 years would probably be the better pace.
We need that acclimation time, right?
Yeah.
We're at that base camp. We need the acclimation time to kind of get used to the things that we're doing now. You talked about this being a people problem. That's a challenge that we all face, right? Every government agency out there has vendors knocking their door down, telling them how they're going to achieve zero trust. Oh, we can do this for you. And, there are great products in the world. And, this is not meant to disparage those vendors at all, right? I spend a good portion of my day talking with people who showed up because they're genuinely interested in national security and they want to move the ball forward and they think that their tools can do that. And many of them are probably right. But a hammer doesn't make you a carpenter, right? A race car doesn't make you a race car driver, right? The thing that we need to focus on, complementary to the tool, is who are the people who are doing that job for each of these capabilities, and what processes are they following, right? So if I'm talking about something very discrete, very tactical, managing user accounts, right? Getting rid of user accounts that are stale, that have, people have left the agency or whatever. There are tools that can help us do that, but not without people operating them, not without, or at least non-person entities that have been programmed by people to operate them in a particular way, and not without making decisions, fully informed decisions about how that should work, right? So what is our policy? How long should we wait? What are the exceptions, right? If we don't have answers to those people and policy questions, the people and process questions, the tools don't help us yet.
Yeah, to your point about the hammer too, Don, achieving zero trust strikes me as contrary to what experts like you and everybody else that I talk to across the federal government has said about zero trust, that it's not something, that there's a range there. Once you climb one mountain, there's another range. So it's not necessarily something, it doesn't sound like, that one will ever, or an agency will ever achieve, right? It'll be an ongoing process, and after this thing, there'll be another thing. Is that a fair read?
It is, and it's something we wrestle with, because we still have to measure ourselves, right? Two things can be true at once. One, journey's never over. Two, we have to be able to measure the journey, right? We still have to count the steps we've made. We still have to count the steps we can see, right? We know the goalpost's going to move, right? That's given. So we're always going to be learning, right? Our enemies are going to change. We're going to change, right? So that's going to happen, but we have to account for progress anyway. And so while there's not a definition of done with zero trust, there has to be a definition of done with what we can do now to protect this asset, this resource, this data now, right? And that's a very tactical concern. So getting people to think in both frames of reference at once is really challenging.
Do we have a sense yet of what that range looks like, of what whatever the thing is that comes after this Mount Everest that Don's climbing now, what that looks like? Or do we have to get closer to the top of the mountain to be able to see what the next item in the range looks like?
Sure. So I think we're still assessing like what the next set of tools, if you want to call it that, or what the next priorities and goals will be. And we want to be careful talking about like what Don just talked about, having time to understand like what agencies really are and their challenges. I can give an example. When John Kindervag, the father of Zero Trust, released the Zero Trust model like 10 years ago, I remember from my position at State Department, we interpreted that as to be NAC, Network Access Control. Well, now 10 years later, you really don't hear about NAC and the Zero Trust discussion anymore. So you need time for some of this to marinate and mature to understand where the technology is shifting, where to go forward.
How much of what's over the horizon depends on what happens from the threat landscape? How much of it depends on what happens technologically, what organizations like federal agencies are prone to want to use to achieve their missions, and how much of it comes from other factors, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of that coin. One side is, to your point, the future looking, artificial intelligence in both how it can be used proactively by the defenders and how it can be used in adversarial ways is certainly dominating some of those discussions about what's coming next or where do we need to start looking at. And frankly, I think a lot of agencies, they're not as much about looking for new technology. A lot of discussions towards Zero Trust has been collapsing that tech stack, getting more enterprise level security across that, like a DHS itself and all the components, or HHS with their Optives, or Commerce with all their bureaus. It's just being able to have an enterprise level view of what's going on. But once you start having those signals and telemetry and that awareness, then I think you can start moving out in new ways toward understanding what needs to be accessed, why it needs to be accessed, how it be accessed. I think those are some of the interesting discussions we're just starting to have as we have these enterprise level tools being available.
What's driving that conversation right now, at least?
I think part of it, to be fair, I think goes back to the White House and the measurement discussions. And to be fair, it could be the Hill or it could be GAO, but there are certainly concerns about, okay, we have the maturity model out there. There's interest in how do we assess where an agency is at now. And so, again, something that goes back to the measurement. At CISA, we have the Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program, CDM. Matt House and team have been very public about they now have a dashboard the agency can use to measure. Some of that leans back in terms of what the CDM program's doing on the Zero Trust tenets from the NIST publication toward rich telemetry, contextual analysis of what's going on. So I think some of that measurement, again, toward that CDM dashboard, the visibility, I think that'll be where some of the interest starts evolving from where it's been the last few years.
If I may, there's also a danger there. And the danger is we get fascinated with metrics, right? So we crave metrics. We want to know how we're doing. Everybody wants feedback. The problem with metrics is you get what you ask for, right? And it's very much like wishes from a genie. It's never quite going to be what you expected. And if you ask for more, you're going to get more. But that doesn't mean it's better. Right? That doesn't mean it's what you needed to know. Mm-hmm. That's kind of, so we're trying to drive the conversation now beyond the point of having a basic vocabulary around Zero Trust. I think we all understand what Zero Trust is. We've got the concepts, right? It's more about what's most important now. Where do I spend that scarce dollar or that scarce minute next, right? And that comes down to a very sort of definitional thing about Zero Trust, which is exactly, right, what we were just talking about. Of understanding your resources that you're defending and understanding who has to have access to those resources at any given time and at all times, right? And where they are, right? We have to know what they are, we have to know where they are, and we have to know who has to have access to them all the time. And that's a very expensive, very difficult proposition. And, we're kind of coaching ourselves through, can we do that with everything? Do we have to prioritize how we do that? And is that a marker? Is that something that we can measure progress against, right? Maybe I'm not applying every protection to every resource I have, but for my most important resources, what am I doing?
Do you use a traditional risk management framework to do that kind of analysis, or is there something special that's required for a cybersecurity or a Zero Trust environment when you're thinking about a risk management problem?
So traditional RMF isn't really built around Zero Trust concepts, right? It is something we do. Compliance is a thing. right? Compliance is necessary. It's not sufficient. So I think the key to understanding that is not that we want to do away with RMF, not that we want to think, that RMF is dead. No, it's that we have to do this in a way that is actually approachable and sustainable, right? We can't spend 18 months going and getting an ATO and then coming back in 3 years, because that does not make us secure. Mm-hmm. It's a chalk line. It's a chalk line snapped at a point in time. I think the key there, though, is understanding that the motivation behind RMF was correct, right? There are requirements. You have to meet those requirements, and you have to measure whether or not you met those requirements. And that's important, right? So how do you balance those concerns? I think the way you balance those concerns is you focus more on the platform as the plateau, right? We want system owners to think higher up the stack, right? We want people who want to bring capability to bear on the mission to be focused on that capability, and not how to build a secure platform in the cloud, and not how to run continuous monitoring for themselves, mm-hmm. and not what security tools they need to support all that, and not how the SOC or the NOSC works, right? We want to do that for you. And we want you to focus on your mission and the uniqueness that you bring to it, right? And invest your scarce dollars there, as opposed to redoing things that others can do well and have done well.
There's a certain art to this, and that's hard to measure, right? So, like, I like to pick on NASA a little bit, right? They have Voyager satellites are 10 billion miles away. No one's saying that we need to put like a fission-resistant MFA device on them, or something on the Mars rover. Just like you're saying, each agency needs a little autonomy and be able to adapt and understand the data that needs to be secure, and it needs to be secured based on the agency's mission in ways that's different for each one. That's why we have to give some flexibility and not just be a compliance exercise for all.
How much of that requires some analysis of something, and how much of it's just kind of common sense and obvious on the face of it, like the Mars rover example?
I think that's a question we'll be talking about for a while. Again, going back to CDM, we have that dashboard, that visibility, but again, there are areas where a dashboard or visibility are just not going to be able to measure. We talk about the discipline. There's no tool that's going to be able to understand how is the zero trust principles being adopted across the leadership chain, and so it needs to be a balance between those two. I look back. The story I like is there was a museum. They had a piece of art on the wall for 70 plus years, and everyone came in and said, "This is beautiful. This is a great piece of art." Well, then the museum found a photograph, and the painter was painting it 70 years ago, and the museum had it upside down for 70 plus years. Everyone thought that was perfect for 70 plus years, and that's kind of where I'm going with zero trust. Is the eye of the beholder a little bit of what we're trying to do here.
We have about 30 seconds left on in this part of the program. If we get together a year from now, where would you like to see DHS, and where would you like to see the components on their zero trust journeys?
I would like us to have the same level of understanding of the resources we defend that we have about the systems that we have about the networks that we have. If you ask me what networks we have, I can give you a list of them, right? I can tell you all sorts of great things about them. If you ask me what systems we have, I can give you a list of them, and I can tell you all sorts of great things about them. Right now, today, if you ask me what resources are most important to us that we're defending, I'm going to shuffle my feet a little bit. I'm going to hem and haw a little bit. I'm going to tell you hypothetically how that might work, but I don't know with the same level of clarity about the resources we're defending as I do about our systems, our networks, our other cyber terrain. So that's where I want to be in a year.
Don Yeske, Sean Connolly, it's great to talk to both of you. Thanks for your time today. You can read more about Zero Trust at DHS and at CISA, and find links to the resources we talked about at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, Zero Trust at the Pentagon. In Depth continues in a moment. Don't go away. If you want insights from agency and industry leaders on the latest topics in technology, management, workforce, defense, and acquisition, sign up for the FedGov Today podcast with me, Francis Rose. I release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, so you'll stay up to date on the issues that matter most to federal government leaders. Listen at fedgovtoday.com and everywhere you get your shows. Don't miss out on the conversation. Follow the podcast today. Welcome back. The Defense Department has set a goal to implement its Zero Trust framework by fiscal year 2027. DoD Chief Information Officer John Sherman told me at DOTUS in December the department's on track to meet that goal. Randy Resnick is director of the Zero Trust Portfolio Management Office at DoD. John Salen is Vice President of Cyber Solutions at GDIT. Gentlemen, welcome. It's great to see you. Randy, welcome. I'll go to you first.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, I talked to John about this, and he was very explicit about the fact that you're focused on making sure that you're meeting the mission requirements of Zero Trust and not just checking off a whole bunch of items on the list of controls, 90 some, I think.
Right.
How are you going about doing that? How are you assessing success if checking the boxes is not the way that you want to do that?
Well, when we first, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thanks. It's good to be here. When we came up with the definition of Zero Trust, we realized that the equipment that makes up the infrastructure for Zero Trust has to be integrated. So once you start integrating equipment with the diversity of the vendors that are out there, you start getting to an understanding that there's no way that the government could continue to dictate the type of items we need, because they're not individual items anymore. It's not like I need to buy a firewall, I need to buy an endpoint thing, or I need to buy a gateway. It's not that anymore. So we started thinking, okay, we spent 30 years doing it the old way. It hasn't really worked. It hasn't kept up with the TTPs of the adversary. So instead, why don't we try a different thing? Why don't we say the outcome that we want to achieve in Zero Trust? For us in the DoD, it's stopping the adversary, dead in the tracks, and then work backwards and allow industry to innovate on that concept, which allows for a tremendous amount of innovation. And that's exactly what we've seen in the last 2 years. So we think we have a winning idea. Industry likes it a lot because we're not telling them what to do anymore. It's not a checklist, but in a way, we're describing what needs to get done in terms of the 91 activities for our target ZT. But how to go about doing it and which products need to be weaved together and integrated, that's up to them. We just want the outcome.
How do you respond to that? That's what industry's been asking for everything for forever, as long as I can remember, isn't it,
Oh my
John?
God, it's music to my ears. I love it, and we've had this conversation before. You know, I sometimes come off as a little heretical when I say this, but you know, I firmly believe that cybersecurity, particularly Zero Trust, but in general, it's not about compliance. It's not even really about IT. It's about meeting the mission objectives.
That's right.
And your focus on the outcomes, your focus on stopping the adversary is exactly right. Because for me, as a system developer, as a system builder, I would much rather have use cases. Tell me what you're trying to achieve. Don't give me a bunch of shall statements. And this approach is perfectly in line with that. Tell me what the outcomes are. Tell me what activities we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to stop the adversarial TTPs. And let's just go after it.
And I don't think you've ever heard of that concept prior to Zero Trust.
Certainly not in federal.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not in federal. It's very much a Silicon Valley, agile development, user story driven concept. And I love that, because there are so many proof points of the effectiveness of telling me what, don't tell me how.
Right.
How do you in the department and you in industry consider that concept when you're doing things like pushing it out to the tactical edge, another thing that John and I talked about at DOTUS?
Yep. So we are describing the problem at the tactical edge. Basically, a lot of people think of Zero Trust as only at the enterprise level. Imagine we're in a room this size, but it's packed with air conditioners, dehumidifiers. You know, that's how people think of enterprise. Mm-hmm. But in the tactical edge, depending on the service that you are, if you're the Navy, it might very well be a submarine. If you're in the Marines, it's an individual or a team rolling in the mud.
Now, and for CJADC2, it will be all of those things.
It will be all of
right?
that, right. It'll be the signals. Mm-hmm. So everybody has a different story of what a tactical edge is. And so for Zero Trust, that becomes very complex, because depending on the device that you're using at the tactical edge, it may or may not be able to have the storage or an operating system even that you need for Zero Trust. That's number one. Number two is Zero Trust fundamentally needs or requires an identity of the user, of the people that you're communicating with, of other devices. And so if you're completely disconnected, that's what the tactical edge really means. They call it DDIL. If by chance the internet goes down and you're completely disconnected and you have a ZT infrastructure, how do you continue to communicate and do your mission? We don't want to not allow the mission to continue. So we need to think about innovative ways to bring down what is absolutely required and cache it locally, or to do other innovative things that industry brings to bear, because I'm describing as the government or the ZTPFMO the problem, and I'm saying this is the problem, give me a solution for the outcome that I need to get. Yeah. And so we're looking at all kinds of different solutions. I don't want to name products and such, but they're existing, and a lot of companies are developing or building new product to fulfill this requirement. And that's exactly what the DoD wants to see. We want to see a diversity of equipment that performs in the toughest situations.
John, about the edge, you wrote recently, ZT becomes particularly critical as you move down to the tactical edge. How so, and why is that? What multiplies that as one gets closer to the edge?
Well, I think something that Randy said is really important here when we talk about tactical edge, which is the tactical edge is different depending on the service and the mission.
That's right.
It could be at the individual human level. It could be at the platform level, something like a submarine or a ship. It could be a deployed unit, or it could be, the Army looks at the division as their unit of action for a core, or from a unit of action to peel down to the tactical edge at some levels. Each of those face different challenges. They all have different missions to some degree, and the piece parts that comprise that zero trust solution, like Randy was saying, at the individual level, you're not going to have the storage and computing capacity that you would at a platform level or a vehicle level, or certainly at the division level. So that's where it becomes important to understand that one size does not fit all, and you have to think about zero trust in terms of, I like to look at it in terms of capability bricks. I don't necessarily need the entire set to do everything at the enterprise and push that down to every tier of tactical. So understanding what the right set is for each tactical mission is important. And I think that's why it's so important to look at that.
So in cybersecurity, what John just said is so important, and why what he said is so true. When you're in a tactical environment, you could think of the data that you're exchanging as limited in terms of its sensitivity. It's not up to me to decide how long that sensitivity is, but I could tell you it doesn't need to be stored or saved for 30 years. So that being said, you could lighten the load of zero trust, but still absolutely over-design what you require and still allow that communication to happen. Still protecting the data much longer than really the data classification needs to be saved. Sometimes it's minutes, sometimes it's hours or weeks, but whatever it is, that has to be decided with the data owner. But we need to build devices, zero trust devices, that at least protect at what it needs to do, which might mean less than 91 activities to achieve zero trust.
Yeah.
Because again, these devices are lighter, they're more nimble, they have to operate perhaps in a disconnected, so they need to still work, but not at the rigor of an enterprise level. And so we're trying to find that balance point. That's a great conversation we're having in the DoD, and people are starting to resonate with it.
What's your sense of where that conversation's going, where different organizations or groups of people are in that conversation?
So that conversation is maturing, and inside the DoD ZTPFMO, we've come to the conclusion, just as we call it the fan chart, this 91 and the 152. It's become infamous. But the question becomes, do we need a fan chart, an additional fan chart for DDIL? Or do we need an additional fan chart for OT devices? Or do we need a fan chart perhaps for weapon systems? So we've had this conversation the portfolio office has with the joint staff and all kinds of other services in and out of the building. All three that I just mentioned are very, very important. However, when we first began the program, we focused on the IT because that was the elephant in the room. So I think we conquered the way to do zero trust in IT, and that's what everybody sees at the present day, and the strategy was written that way. But the other three fan charts, I think, need some development, and I've committed to having my team do that this rest of the fiscal year and beyond, and perhaps come out with a more official fan chart a year plus from now. Not to mandate anything in the next few months because we're not there yet, but at least think through the technology, talk to subject matter experts in the field, vendors, very important, and to find out exactly where the right level is. And even the activity names might have to be changed because things in OT might not be anything close to the activities in IT. They may be some different things, so we have to customize it. So that's why I'm saying I think we need to customize because these are vectors of attack. You need to have zero trust on them at some level, and we can't ignore it. So I think that's something that we need to do going forward, and that's how we would solve that problem.
John, I think I jumped on top of you. You wanted to make a point, and I followed on to Randy a little too quickly.
No, not at all. The differences between IT and OT make the zero trust concept, particularly at the tactical edge, a fascinating question because the way the OT sensors, devices, Internet of Things, we start bringing in drones, remotely piloted vehicles, bring all of this in, they behave. And they behave differently from traditional IT systems. They don't all have the same capabilities. Some of these sensors, like a thermostat, which could be an entry point, right? If I'm an adversary, I'm not going to go in hot and hard on the most hardened entry point. I'm going to try to come in and flank you from your least protected device. And that's what we see a lot of. And those OT devices, they don't have as much capabilities in some cases. So thinking about those nuances and how the OT side of the house works with the IT side of the house is where zero trust allows us to, I think, improve our overall security posture over a network-centric, kind of old-school security model of perimeter security, because it's those little entry points that often get lost in the shuffle.
All right, so that collaboration, John, of IT and OT takes me to another point that you wrote about recently, and that is, you phrase it this way, the importance of getting ZT out of the lab and into the field. How do you perceive organizations in government, not to pick on Randy and his team at DoD, how are people doing that, though, at operationalizing these ideas, these technologies, these concepts?
And that's why it's so important to get out of the lab and into the field. You can only do so much in the lab. I love labs. I love tinkering as much as any engineer, as much as any nerd. Like we said at the beginning, it's all driven by use cases. And we can only define the use cases that we can based on our imagination. We put this technology, we put these capabilities out in the hands of the operators, in this case the warfighters, and they're going to stun us with how they would employ this capability and how they would use it. And that's the real value of getting in the field. And we've had some really interesting successes with field exercises like Talisman Sabre and Yamasakura last year, where we were working with Indo-PACOM and Army First Corps. I mean, great feedback from the operators and from the warfighters on, yeah, it's nice that you did this in the lab. That's not really the way we would do this. And that's the value.
What do you see as far as getting this out there to put it in the hands of the people who will use it? And it's not, to be fair, just warfighters. It's not just the tip of the spear. It's the entire enterprise of the department, right?
Yep, and it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
So in order to do all of this, I think that we're talking about, we have to we have to change the way, in my mind, we need to change the way industry works amongst themselves. I mentioned earlier that we needed this integration thing going on, that not any one company really could deliver full zero trust at the target level, this 91. You need a minimum of a bunch of companies, let's say 5, could be more, where you have to integrate your products together. And that's not so easy. So having companies work together normally as frenemies now, whereas before they were competitors, is really antithesis to the business plan of yesterday. So I've encouraged vendors privately and publicly in some of the talks I've given that you have to start working together, because the Department of Defense is not going to do the integration anymore. We failed at that. We're not good at that. We fight wars, battles. We aren't really that good. We're not experts in the products that we're integrating. The vendors are. So we would rather have the vendors work the hard problems out, which includes patching, and get a secure configuration per our design based on the outcome we want. And really all we want is to install it and then have a patching schedule and allow us to move our data, our users or whatever into this new environment. So that, I think, is the future. In order to do that, we need to get vendors working together. So when we do that, it's not only the DoD that's going to benefit. I've been talking, the portfolio office has been talking to the FedCiv community. They have their strategy for zero trust. They're going at a different pace, that's fine. But when you squint your eyes, you'll see the DNA of the DoD strategy for ZT inside. When you look at what the IC is doing, same exact thing. And over the last 2 years since the portfolio office has been formed, we've been contacted by the Five Eyes, our allies in Indo-PACOM, NATO, others. So they all are starting on their zero trust journey. The DoD is far ahead of everybody else in the thinking process, and they're asking for our documents and for help. And so as long as they're an ally, we're leaning forward and doing what we can to strengthen not only their networks, but obviously we're on a very fast pace to strengthen ours.
John, we have a little bit less than a minute left. What are you telling the people that you work with in government that they should be paying attention to over the horizon a year from now or 2 years from now, that maybe is not something they need to deal with today, but is something that they should be aware of that's coming down the pike?
I think that what I usually tell them is start now. Make some progress and learn as much as you can, because we can't predict what our adversaries are going to be doing, what their TTPs are going to be doing a year from now, 5 years from now. And I think that collaboration is necessary, it's critical, but it's critical to get started. And I love what you said, Randy, about working together in collaboration. And I may end up, probably fired for saying this, but I agree with you. My candle
Nothing
doesn't.
wrong with that.
My candle doesn't burn brighter by putting out someone else's. And I think that that working with our frenemies is important. Working with our competimates is critical. And let's get at it. Yeah.
And let's not forget the DIB. They'll benefit as well.
That's right.
John and Randy, it's a great conversation. Thanks for joining me today. You can read more about zero trust in DoD and find a link to the Defense Department's zero trust strategy at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the civilian agency view of zero trust. In Depth continues in a moment.
If you want insights from agency and industry leaders on the latest topics in technology, management, workforce, defense, and acquisition, sign up for the FedGov Today podcast with me, Francis Rose. I release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, so you'll stay up to date on the issues that matter most to federal government leaders. Listen at fedgovtoday.com and everywhere you get your shows. Don't miss out on the conversation. Follow the podcast today.
Welcome back. The Zero Trust EO I mentioned at the beginning of the program has 6 major components for agencies to meet. Each agency has a strategy to implement those components. Paul Blahush is Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of Labor. Jim Richburg is Head of Cyber Policy at Fortinet. and a Fortinet Federal board member. He's former National Intelligence Manager for Cyber at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Gentlemen, welcome. It's good to see both of you. Paul, I start with you. Give regards to my friend Gundeep at the Labor Department. Where are you and your colleagues on your Zero Trust journey at Labor?
Hi, it's great to be here, Francis. Thanks for the invitation. And when I think about the Zero Trust journey we've been on, I got to recall back to when I started as the CISO at Department of Labor. This was, I don't know, sometime in 2018. We were actually doing our piece for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We do quite a show for that at Department of Labor. I was being recorded, a little bit like I am now, and it's like, hey, talk about what some of the goals are for cybersecurity in the Department of Labor. And one of the things on our list, again, this was 2018, was Zero Trust. We're going to start moving to a Zero Trust network architecture. Now, between 2018 and the executive order in 2021, I would say there wasn't a lot that happened with that. It was more a paper thing. Mm-hmm. But boy, did that executive order sort of light a fuse then. Like, okay, we need to now move in that direction. So what have we done? And I think one thing was that we were able to start from a really good base. And a lot of people say the base for Zero Trust is identity. Well, if there was one area of the Zero Trust portfolio that Department of Labor was sort of out ahead about, it was identity. We were really strong already in trying to consolidate all our identity sources into one and then leverage that for people authenticating into resources. Mm-hmm. So we had a good base there, but we took a look around and said, well, now what else do we need to do? There's all those little pillars and stuff that CISA put out, mm-hmm. all those different ways to think about Zero Trust, whether it's the NIST guidance or DoD or whatever. So well, what do we need? We said, this idea, this concept of taking what was kind of a fortification approach, right? We've got our perimeter and we're good inside and we don't trust these people outside. We got to take that and turn that around to say that we need to be able to secure from everywhere for everything. And we looked at how are we going to, what's out there to do that? And we sort of focused in on the secure access service edge solutions. We looked at some of the product vendors in that space and we chose one. And we made a commitment to go in that direction. And we're about a year into that now, because that was 2023 March when we made a purchase in that area. And we've moved along pretty well. We have a goal of by June of 2024 to have that deployed throughout Department of Labor. So that's sort of where we're at with our Zero Trust journey now. Now, using a SASE solution doesn't buy everything, right? There's a whole bunch of other things that go into that, and we still have a lot of work to do. Not only because just deploying your SASE solution doesn't do a lot until you can turn some of those things on. You need to turn those capabilities on. Mm-hmm. And that's not the June 2024 target. Right. It's just to get it deployed everywhere.
Sure.
And I still think we have a lot to do in logging. The enhanced logging piece of it, of getting that information and making it actionable, got a lot to do with data. The identification of your data types, categorization of the data, and then finding a way to effectively and efficiently tag it so you can do something with it. You can monitor and manage it. I think that's where we're at Department of Labor.
Jim, welcome. It's great to talk to you again. I think you and I have been talking about these issues since the days of perimeter protection that Paul referred to.
Exactly.
How does what Paul described comport with what you're seeing across government? I imagine they had an advantage because they had moved out early on the identity piece.
Yes, they did. And I look at Zero Trust and I say it's a good news, bad news story. When I retired from government, I would have fierce, almost theological conversations with my former peers in government who said that Zero Trust could not be done realistically and at scale. Because one of the things I learned when I left government and went to a major tech provider was, oh my goodness, these people have solved a lot of these problems that we're unaware of the solutions in government. And Zero Trust was one of those issues. And then, and your other guests have said this, Executive Order 14028 comes out and all of a sudden, government is bought. They're all in on Zero Trust. The good news is this is a partnership in the sense that government does a really good job creating frameworks, technical reference architecture, strategies, whether they're for the entirety of government with the OMB memo or DoD's strategy. They may have the hardest job. all the implementation tools, and Paul talked about this, are commercial solutions. They don't make their own stuff. They implement it. So we're providing this. So the good news is this really has helped to advance progress on something that is a concept we all agreed was a good idea, even though I find zero trust as an off-putting label, especially for people in the public sector. Your audience, yeah, we all understand what it's shorthand for. Take it to the general workforce and they still say, what do you mean? I'm in a position of public trust. You don't trust me? It's a safety net. It's a way to help them do their job better. Now, the other good news is prior to the executive order, I'd say some of the Fortune 500 companies were doing things that looked and sounded like zero trust, even though we may not have called them that in the private sector. Since the executive order, the latest statistics I've seen are that over 60% of medium and close to 100% of large companies are doing zero trust as well. So this rising tide is collectively increasing resilience, which is a big focus area. That's the good news, and I'll tease you with the bad news when we...
Well, no, you can't leave me hanging. Now, if you're going to tell me about the good news and say there's bad news, then you have to give me some of that.
So part of the bad news is, okay, 60% plus of the private sector are doing this, but I read a market study recently that said by 2027, most of their efforts were going to stall out when they ran into, and I know one of your other guests talked about integration, vendor integration. A lot of the vendors are getting really good at creating capabilities. Unfortunately, we're in siloed worlds. And it's becoming the most acute when you talk about the policy enforcement points that actually drive your ability to implement zero trust. You've got a whole bunch of walled gardens of how to do this, and unfortunately, it's challenging to say SASE Solution 1 and SASE Solution 2 can share data, can share commands, and the prediction I saw was that 70% of these zero trust solutions were going to implementation was going to hit that cul-de-sac, and it was going to largely be incumbent on us in industry to start finding ways to actually work and play well together on this if we're going to help government make more progress.
Paul, to Jim's point about agencies making stuff, federal CIO about 5 years or so ago when we were talking about the cloud versus data centers said, I don't want to buy stuff anymore. I want to buy services, and this was at the point where that was just starting to ramp up. What does that look like in a zero trust world where you kind of said the same thing a moment ago, and Jim just laid it right out there. Agencies don't want to buy stuff. They want to buy services. How does that fit into the strategy, not specifically the document strategy at the Labor Department, but into the framework, the kind of the worldview of the department?
Well, I think it's integral to the worldview, not only for zero trust, but for the way we operate. We've been moving for quite some time from, the legacy way of doing things, of having a data center, building our own servers, our own networks, and loading applications in there. We've moved over 80% of our capability is now in the cloud. So we've taken that something I can touch and feel model and put it out that it's in a service provider in the cloud. Our security controls with this SASE solution that we have, that's in the cloud. We don't have now things that we buy and start installing in our data center for that. Obviously, there's still a client piece that gets put on people's devices, but we're going more and more towards the service model. We think that's necessary, it's vital, and it aligns with that zero trust architecture academic strategy about how this should work. And that 20% we still have in the data center, I think at least 50% and maybe more of that is planned to be moved out of there. So we're well on our way to being much more fully service-based as opposed to product-based. But I wanted to mention something else about what Jim said. And that is that not only, and it's something I said too, but not only did the executive order open our eyes, but remember what probably led to that executive order coming out, or at least sped it up, crystallized it, and that was SolarWinds. And we realized from SolarWinds that there were so many ways for our adversary to get inside our network that having that sort of architectural philosophy that I can keep bad guys out and only have good guys inside was a fallacy. And we needed to understand that. And zero trust, I agree with you. It's such a terrible way for many audiences to phrase this, right? Because they don't get it. But it really is about, we have to establish trust each time there's a connection, because we can't assume trust just because that device or that connection's coming from inside, right? Isn't that the horror movie where the phone call's coming from inside your house?
From inside the house.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's what some folks, I hadn't connected it that way before, but that's what some folks have said this is like, that not specifically framing it, Jim, as an insider threat, but maybe conceptually that's what folks are talking about.
And again, I used to run the National Insider Threat Program, and I am not a fan of the term insider threat because, again, I think, like zero trust, it is a very Manichaean, black and white way of doing something. I think in the aggregate, a lot more risk is accepted and a lot more things happen because people make mistakes. They're trying to get the job done. It's either human error, we don't give them the right tools in some cases. If we, instead of calling this zero trust, had said this is a safety net, this is technology that's here to let you focus on getting the job done, whether it's data loss prevention or whether it's these other things about identity and access management, we've got your back. Not we are the Orwellian big brother looking over your shoulder because we have zero trust. And well, you talked about SolarWinds as a precipitant for the executive order. Another thing is, let's remember, this is 2021. We were a year into COVID. And I think if that put the death knell in the thought that agencies can have wired perimeter-based operations, because we were all working remotely at that point in time.
Killed the perimeter.
And we realized VPN-based security was causing our agencies to get penetrated. At that point, come inside, and if you could go anywhere, that's part of what made people start saying, I need strong identity and access management, I need microsegmentation. I think it was that combination of looking at a nation-state threat like a SolarWinds and saying the fundamental, we're not going to go back to we're now in hybrid, but the combination of those two things I think were real accelerants of change with the executive order.
And not only that, but at least for us, take it out of the security realm. Our people who were working remotely were getting terrible performance, right? My gosh, I have to sit here and work from home, and I'm getting terrible performance and getting to my Office 365 and getting to my this and that. And we decided pretty early on, people need to get their work done. We need to do something to allow people to get their work done. And then we broke off and said, well, you're going to come in through the VPN for the stuff that's in the data center. But if you're going out to our Office 365 cloud, we're going to route you straight to that cloud. And we were able to do that. We had the technology components in place to be able to do that, and that really saved us on the bandwidth and on the performance and getting people to do their work. Because 100% I agree with you that workers want to get their work done. They want to do it safely. If given the choice, they're saying, yes, I would like to do my work safely so that I don't compromise mission. It's all about mission, right? We want to get mission done, we want to get it done safely. Mission can't be accomplished successfully if it's not done safely. But you're right, we've got to give them not only the tools, but an environment that works for them to do their work successfully. I've always, or too many times, have found that if you make security a barrier for someone to do their work, they will find a way around that barrier that may not be the safest way to do it. So you need to make this seamless. And that's another thing that I like about the zero trust environment that I think is being created at lots of places, including at labor. We're able to sell this not only as a security feature, which I can sell it as that, right? I can talk about, advanced nation-state actors, this can stop this, it stops lateral movement, it's required by the executive order, start seeing eyelids go down, right? Like, okay, he's talking about security again. But if I talk about this is going to allow your staff to get their work done more seamlessly, it's going to allow quicker access to applications because we're not backhauling everything. I was tracking a package for the holidays, right? And it's coming from overseas, comes into New York, and I'm like, oh great, it's in New York, it's going to be getting here soon. Then it went to St. Louis to the distribution center. And I'm like, okay, well this is like pre-zero trust, where we were backhauling it's got to go back to the data center. We're going to be able to take direct flights now. We're just going to go right to where it's accessed. And it allows more data sharing. Data as a strategic asset. We can share that, if we do this right, we can share it safely and securely with state, local, tribal, and other federal partners successfully.
Yeah, I find having a conversation and saying, here are the 7 tenets of zero trust, to Paul's point, the eyes glaze over. But if you talk to stakeholders within the organization and say, there are new ways, software-defined networking and cloud, to enable the connection of users, devices, compute resources, and data, regardless of where any of those 4 elements are located and securely. What can that empower? What can that allow you to do in terms of new capability, whether it's greater service level for the remote user? I mean, if you put it that way, it's not here's a security requirement the executive order says we have to comply with. It's how can we help digital transformation? How can we enable you to do new things, to do them faster?
It becomes a productivity feature.
Bingo.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Instead, we're starting to run out of time, Paul. We talked about where you are at labor today. Where would you like to be in a year or 2 years? What does that look like at some future point, Paul?
Well, I think I mentioned that by June of 2024, we've got a target of having this SASE solution deployed to all client devices. And actually, that's a commitment that we have because these are TMF funds. And when you get a TMF award, you've got to tell them what you're going to do with it. They don't give you a loan and go, here, don't worry about what you're going to do with it. So we had to say, hey, here's things we're going to do. And one target we have is to deploy it by the end of Q3, which is June. But if I'm looking out past that, boy, that's just like, having a Ferrari and driving it on your neighborhood street. We've got to get this out now.
Yeah.
We've got to get it out so it's doing data loss protection. So it's doing analysis of the trustworthiness of the device and the identity and compiling all those together so we can make choices about, is this connection I want to allow or not? We also need to I think we need to get a handle on that data piece. Because right now, data is more just a big globus of, yes, that's sensitive data. Everything's sensitive data. But can we start identifying, categorizing it, and tagging it so that our tools can start making sure this isn't going where it's not supposed to go? I think it's very powerful. So those 2 things, I'd like to more fully realize the capabilities and get to data.
Paul, it's great to have you on the program. Jim, great to talk to you as well. I appreciate both of you joining me today. You can read more about zero trust at civilian agencies at fedgovtoday.com. As you probably learned from this program, the zero trust landscape in government's already filled with projects and potential. FedGov Today will keep you up to date on FedGov Today TV, Sunday mornings at 10:30 on ABC 7 in Washington and on our YouTube channel, on the FedGov Today podcast every Wednesday, wherever you get your shows, and always on demand at fedgovtoday.com. My thanks to our guests from DHS, CISA, DOD, and Labor, and our sponsors from GDIT and Fortinet Federal. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for watching.